She stood before Judge Patricia Whitmore in courtroom 4B wearing a simple gray cardigan and dark jeans, hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the mahogany bench. The charge was minor, disturbing the peace during a protest outside City Hall. Standard fine, maybe probation. Nothing that would normally warrant more than 5 minutes of judicial attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But when Judge Whitmore opened the manila folder containing her case file, something made her pause. The defendant's background check was surprisingly thin. Claire Donovan, age 32, clean record except for this single incident. No employment. History listed, no known address beyond a post office box. No emergency contacts. Even her fingerprints had come back with an unusual flag from the federal database. Not a criminal marker, but something that made the system hesitate before processing. The arresting officer, Detective Marcus Torres, had noted something odd in his report. The woman had been standing completely still during the chaos of the protest. Not chanting, not holding signs, just observing. When police moved in to disperse the crowd, she had walked directly to Torres and extended her wrists for handcuffs before he had even approached her. No resistance, no questions, no requests for a phone call. She had simply said, "I'm ready." Judge Whitmore glanced up at the defendant. Claire Donovan stood with perfect posture, breathing steady, expression neutral. There was something about her stillness that suggested discipline rather than resignation. Military bearing, perhaps, though no service record appeared in her file. "Ms. Donovan," Judge Whitmore began, "you were arrested during the demonstration outside City Hall on November 15th. The charge is disturbing the peace, though I see here that Officer Torres noted you weren't actively participating in any disruptive behavior." Claire nodded once. "That's correct, Your Honor." Her voice was calm, clear, with no trace of nervousness or defiance. Most defendants showed some emotion: anger, fear, frustration, remorse. Claire Donovan showed nothing but respectful attention. The protest was regarding the city's handling of the Riverside District redevelopment project. Judge Whitmore continued, reading from the report. Community members were upset about displaced families and inadequate relocation assistance. Were you personally affected by the redevelopment? No, Your Honor. Do you live in the Riverside District? No, Your Honor. Then why were you there? Claire was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. I was observing the situation. Judge Whitmore found this answer unsatisfying but legally irrelevant. The woman had been arrested at a public demonstration, regardless of her motivations. But something about the case felt incomplete, like reading a book with several pages missing. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, had recommended a standard fine and community service. Routine disposition for a first-time misdemeanor. But Walsh had also included an unusual note in her recommendation. Defendant demonstrated cooperative behavior throughout the booking process. No flight risk. Recommend community service assignment that utilizes organizational skills. Organizational skills. An odd observation for someone arrested at a protest. Judge Whitmore studied Claire Donovan more carefully. The woman's clothes were unremarkable but well-fitted. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style. No visible jewelry except for a simple watch with a black band. Her hands showed no calluses or signs of manual labor, but her fingernails were trimmed short and clean. Professional appearance without obvious profession. Ms. Donovan, do you have employment? I'm between assignments at the moment, Your Honor. Between assignments. Not unemployed, not looking for work, but between assignments. The phrasing suggested someone who worked project-based rather than in traditional employment. What type of work do you do? Again, the slight pause before answering. Consulting. What kind of consulting? Problem resolution. Judge Whitmore was beginning to understand why the background check had been so sparse. Claire Donovan answered questions precisely, but revealed nothing beyond the minimum required. Professional evasion disguised as cooperation. The judge looked at her calendar. The morning docket was packed with cases far more serious than a peaceful protest arrest. Drug charges, assault, theft, domestic violence. Claire Donovan represented the kind of minor infraction that usually received swift, standard processing. But something about the defendant's demeanor suggested she expected exactly that outcome, as if she had calculated the judicial response with precision and was simply waiting for the process to conclude according to her predictions. Judge Whitmore made a decision that surprised herself. Ms. Donovan, I'm sentencing you to 60 hours of community service, to be completed within the next 90 days. You'll be assigned to work with the Riverside District Community Center, specifically assisting with their neighborhood improvement program. For the first time, Claire showed a reaction. The slightest tightening around her eyes, barely perceptible, but definitely present. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition. As if the judge had just said something significant. The community center serves the same population that was protesting outside City Hall, Judge Whitmore continued. The people affected by the redevelopment project you were observing. You'll report to Maria Santos, the center's program coordinator, this Friday at 9 a.m. Claire nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Santos runs programs for displaced families, job training, housing assistance, and youth services. She'll assign you specific duties based on the center's current needs. I understand. Judge Whitmore closed the file, but found herself reluctant to dismiss the case. There was something about Claire Donovan that didn't align with the simple facts of her arrest. The thin background, the professional evasiveness, the way she had voluntarily surrendered to police during a chaotic situation. Ms. Donovan, is there anything else the court should know about your circumstances? Claire met the judge's eyes directly. For the first time during the hearing, her gaze was steady, intelligent, and completely unreadable. No, Your Honor. I'm prepared to fulfill the community service requirement. Judge Whitmore gavelled the case closed and called the next defendant. Claire Donovan gathered her small purse and walked toward the courtroom exit with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the hearing. No hurry, no relief, no apparent concern about the sentence. As she reached the door, Judge Whitmore noticed something that would stick with her for the rest of the day. Claire Donovan had turned slightly to glance back at the courtroom, and for just a moment, her expression had changed. The neutral mask had slipped, revealing something that looked almost like satisfaction. As if the community service sentence wasn't a punishment at all, but exactly what she had been hoping to receive. The Riverside District Community Center occupied a converted warehouse on Elm Street, its brick facade painted bright yellow with murals depicting families and children playing. Inside, the main hall buzzed with activity as Maria Santos moved between folding tables, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers who were sorting donated clothing and organizing food pantry supplies. Maria had been running community programs for 12 years, ever since the economic downturn had forced the closure of 3 manufacturing plants in the district. She understood how quickly neighborhoods could change, how families who had lived in the same houses for generations could suddenly find themselves displaced by developers who saw potential where residents saw home. The redevelopment project had accelerated everything. 67 families relocated in 8 months, most to housing they couldn't afford in areas where their children had to change schools and their commutes to work became impossible. The community center had become a lifeline, providing services that overwhelmed city agencies couldn't deliver fast enough. Maria checked her watch. 9:15. The new court-ordered volunteer was late, which wasn't unusual. Most people assigned community service arrived reluctantly, completed their hours with minimal effort, and left without forming any real connection to the work. She had learned not to expect enthusiasm from mandated volunteers. The center's regular volunteers were different. Mrs. Eleanor Chen, who had lost her apartment in the first wave of redevelopment, now coordinated the weekly food distribution. Tommy Rodriguez, whose family had been relocated to a housing complex 40 minutes away, still came back every Saturday to help with the youth basketball program. Sarah Williams, a single mother who had fought the development process for 3 years before accepting a settlement, managed the job training database. These volunteers understood what the families coming through the center were experiencing, because they had experienced it themselves. They knew which children were struggling with the transition to new schools, which parents were working multiple jobs to afford higher rent, which elderly residents were isolated in unfamiliar neighborhoods. "Maria, we need more intake forms," called Danny Park from the reception desk. At 19, Danny was one of the success stories. His family had been among the first to be relocated, but he had secured a scholarship to community college and was studying social work while volunteering 20 hours a week at the center. "Filing cabinet, second drawer," Maria replied, making a note to order more supplies. The center operated on a combination of city funding, private donations, and volunteer labor. Every resource had to be carefully managed. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The front door opened, and Maria looked up to see a woman in dark jeans and a navy blue sweater entering the main hall. She carried a small leather portfolio and moved with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was exactly where she intended to be. "Maria Santos?" the woman asked, approaching the information desk. "That's me. You must be Claire Donovan." "Yes. I apologize for being late. I wanted to review the center's published programs before our meeting." Maria was surprised. Most court-assigned volunteers knew nothing about the center beyond its address. "Where did you find information about our programs?" "Your website, the city's community services directory, and last year's annual report to the United Way." Claire had done research, actual research. Maria's expectations shifted slightly upward. "Well, let me show you around and explain what we do here." They walked through the main hall, where volunteers were preparing for the afternoon's housing assistance workshop. Maria explained how families who had been displaced often needed help navigating the rental market, understanding tenant rights, and finding housing they could afford on reduced incomes. The redevelopment created a shortage of affordable housing throughout the city, Maria said. Families aren't just dealing with moving. They're dealing with a complete restructuring of their economic situation. Claire listened without interrupting, occasionally making brief notes in her portfolio. She asked specific questions about wait times for services, the relationship between the center and City Housing Authority, and how families were prioritized for assistance. They moved to the computer lab, where Sarah Williams was helping residents complete online applications for housing vouchers. The lab had 8 workstations, all occupied, with a waiting list posted on the wall. "We're always behind on the technology side," Maria admitted. "The applications are all digital now, but not everyone has computer skills or internet access." At home, Claire observed the room quietly, watching how Sarah guided an elderly man through the application process, noting which steps required the most explanation and where people seemed to get confused out in the children's area. Eleanor Chun was reading to a group of preschoolers whose parents were attending workshops. The space was bright and welcoming, with educational toys and books, but Maria could see Claire assessing the layout with a critical eye. "We serve about 300 families regularly," Maria explained as they toured the kitchen facilities, where hot meals were prepared for seniors and families in transition. Some need temporary assistance while they get established in new housing. Others require ongoing support because the relocation has created permanent financial hardship. What's the average length of time families need services? Claire asked. It varies. Some people get back on their feet in a few months. Others have been coming here for 2 years and still can't find stable housing they can afford. Claire made another note. Are there families who stopped coming because they resolved their housing situation, or because they gave up on the process? The question caught Maria off guard. Most volunteers focused on the families they could see, not the ones who had disappeared from the system. Both, Maria admitted. We don't have great tracking for outcomes. When people stop coming, we usually don't know if it's because they found housing, or because they moved away or just got overwhelmed by the process. They returned to Maria's office, a cramped space behind the main hall where she managed case files, grant applications, and volunteer schedules. The walls were covered with charts tracking service delivery, funding deadlines, and community needs assessments. So where can I be most useful? Claire asked, settling into the chair across from Maria's desk. Most community service volunteers. Help with basic tasks. Sorting donations, setting up for events, data entry, cleaning. What are you comfortable doing? Whatever needs to be done. Do you have experience with any particular type of work? Claire was quiet for a moment, the same careful pause Maria had noticed when she asked specific questions during the tour. I'm good at identifying problems and developing solutions. That's pretty general. I prefer to observe a situation before making specific claims about what I can contribute. Maria studied Claire's face. There was something about her responses that felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. The way Claire asked questions suggested someone who understood systems and processes, not just individual circumstances. All right. Why don't you start by spending a few days observing our operations? See where you think you might fit in. We'll meet again next week to discuss a specific assignment. Claire stood to leave, then paused at the office door. Maria, have you ever had volunteers who weren't court-assigned? People who just showed up and asked to help, sometimes. Usually people who have been through our services themselves. Why? Just curious about different types of community engagement. After Claire left, Maria found herself wondering about the question. In 12 years of running programs, she had learned to read people quickly. Parents who were struggling but trying to hide it. Residents who were angry about the redevelopment but didn't know how to channel their frustration productively. Volunteers who were genuinely committed versus those who were just fulfilling obligations. Claire Donovan didn't fit any of the familiar categories. She had the observational skills of someone who understood organizational operations, but claimed no relevant experience. She asked questions about outcomes and systems efficiency, but was supposedly there to complete court-mandated service hours. Most puzzling was her question about volunteers who weren't assigned by the court. As if she was trying to understand the difference between people who came because they had to and people who came because they chose to. Maria made a note in Claire's volunteer file. Unusual background. Recommend starting with an observation. Role. Follow up after 1 week. She had no way of knowing that Claire had already spent the previous 3 weeks observing the center's operations from the outside, documenting every family who came and went, tracking which services were used most frequently, and identifying gaps in the program that weren't visible from any organizational chart. Claire had been observing the center's operations for 8 days when the first threatening letter arrived. Maria found it slipped under the office door on a Tuesday morning, printed on plain white paper with no identifying marks. The message was brief. Community center operations will cease within 30 days. Riverside District residents should relocate permanently. No further warnings. Maria stared at the letter, hands trembling slightly. In 12 years of community work, she had received complaints, criticism, even angry phone calls from frustrated residents. But never anything that felt like a direct threat. She locked the letter in her desk drawer and tried to focus on the 5 days schedule. 3 housing workshops, a food distribution for elderly residents, and interviews with 2 families who had been waitlisted for assistance for 6 weeks. Normal operations that served people who depended on the center's stability. But throughout the morning, Maria found herself distracted. Who would want the center closed? The redevelopment project had already displaced most of the families it was designed to move. The remaining residents needed the center's services more than ever. Claire arrived at 10:30, carrying the same leather portfolio she brought every day. She had been assigned to help with intake interviews, documenting new families' housing situations and service needs. Her work was methodical and thorough. She asked follow-up questions that revealed information other volunteers might miss, and her notes were detailed enough that Maria could understand each family's situation without conducting secondary interviews. How many families are currently on the waiting list for housing assistance? Claire asked, settling at the desk where intake files were organized. 47 as of this morning. Why? I'm trying to understand the relationship between demand for services and available resources. Maria had noticed that Claire's questions often focused on capacity and efficiency rather than individual cases. She approached the center's work like someone analyzing a business operation rather than a social service program. At 11:15, Danny Park knocked on Maria's office door. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by obvious concern. "Maria, we have a problem. The insurance company just called. Our liability coverage is being canceled effective next week." Maria felt her stomach drop. Canceled? Why? They said there had been inquiries about the center's risk profile, and they were reassessing coverage for community organizations in areas undergoing redevelopment. Claire looked up from her intake files. Who made the inquiries? Danny glanced at her uncertainly. They wouldn't say. Just that multiple parties had contacted them asking about our coverage and what types of incidents might not be covered. Maria sat down heavily. Without insurance, the center couldn't operate. They couldn't serve meals, run programs, or allow volunteers to work with families. The city required full liability coverage for any organization receiving municipal funding. "How long do we have?" Maria asked. 7 days. I already called 3 other insurance companies. 2 said they weren't accepting new clients in this area, and the 3rd wanted a premium we can't afford. Claire closed her portfolio. "May I ask what your current premium costs?" $1,800 a month, Maria replied. The new quote was $4,700 for the same coverage, for basic liability only. No coverage for programs involving children, no coverage for food service, no coverage for transportation, which meant no coverage for most of what the center actually did. By afternoon, more problems emerged. Sarah Williams discovered that the center's electricity account had been flagged for irregular usage patterns, prompting an immediate inspection by the utility company. Eleanor Chun reported that their primary food supplier had received complaints about food safety concerns at the center, leading to an audit of their kitchen facilities. "This isn't coincidental," Sarah said during an emergency staff meeting. "Someone is systematically targeting our operations." Maria looked around the room at her volunteers and part-time staff. These people had kept the center running through funding cuts, staff turnover, and the chaos of serving families in crisis. Now they were facing coordinated efforts to shut down their work entirely. Who benefits if the center closes? Asked Tommy Rodriguez. "The developers," Danny said immediately. "If there's no community support for displaced families, people have to move further away. Makes the redevelopment cleaner." "But the redevelopment is already approved," Eleanor pointed out. "The legal challenges failed. Most of the families have already been relocated." Claire had been quiet during the discussion, but now she spoke up. "May I see the insurance cancellation notice?" Maria handed her the letter. Claire read it carefully, then asked, "Do you have copies of the complaints that were filed about food Safety and utility usage? The utility company wouldn't give us details, Sarah said. Just that someone had reported suspicious electrical consumption during evening hours. When is the center closed? Exactly. We're only open until 6 p.m. On weekdays, 2 p.m. on Saturdays. Claire made notes in her portfolio. What about the food safety complaints? Anonymous reports claiming they saw unsanitary food handling and improper storage, Eleanor said. Complete fabrication. Our kitchen passes all city inspections. When were these complaints filed? Maria checked her calendar. The insurance. Inquiry was last Thursday. Utility complaint on Friday. Food safety report yesterday. All within a 5-day period, Claire observed. Someone with resources and knowledge of regulatory processes, Maria said. This isn't just harassment. It's a systematic campaign. The realization was devastating. The center had survived budget cuts and staff shortages, but deliberate sabotage was different. Whoever was targeting them understood exactly which regulatory pressure points would be most effective. We need to contact the police, Danny suggested. And tell them what? Sarah asked. That someone filed legitimate complaints through proper channels. These aren't illegal actions. They're coordinated, Tommy insisted, but not a criminal. Annoying, expensive, and effective, but not illegal. Claire stood up. I'd like to review all the documentation you've received. Insurance letters, utility notices, inspection reports. Everything. Maria gathered the files. What are you looking for? Patterns that might indicate who's behind this. You think you can figure out who's targeting us? Claire was quiet for a moment. I think whoever is doing this made assumptions about how quickly they could force the center to close. They're applying pressure at multiple points simultaneously, which suggests either significant resources or detailed knowledge of community service operations. Or both, Maria said grimly. The timeline is aggressive. 30 days from the first. Threatening letter. Insurance canceled in 7 days. Kitchen audit scheduled for next week. Utility inspection the week after that. Claire spread the documents across the conference table, studying them like pieces of a puzzle. Whoever planned this expects the center to close before you can resolve any single issue. They're not trying to shut down your insurance permanently. They're trying to create enough simultaneous crises that you can't maintain operations. So what do we do? Claire looked up from the documents. For the first time since she had started volunteering, her expression showed something other than calm observation. There was a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she took the attacks on the center personally. First, we document everything. Every complaint, every inspection, every canceled service. We create a timeline that shows the coordination. Then what? Then we find out who's behind it. Maria felt a flicker of hope. You think that's possible? I think, Claire said carefully, that people who launch coordinated attacks usually leave more evidence than they realize. That evening, after the center closed, Claire remained behind to organize the documentation. Maria found her still working at 8 p.m., surrounded by files and making detailed notes in her portfolio. You don't have to stay this late, Maria said. Your community service hours don't require overtime. Claire looked up. This isn't about fulfilling court requirements anymore. What is it about? Claire was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Some problems, she said finally, require more than standard solutions. Claire arrived at the center at 6 a.m. on Thursday, 3 hours before it officially opened. Maria found her in the parking lot, sitting in a silver sedan, engine off, watching the building with the same methodical attention she brought to intake interviews. You're here early, Maria said, unlocking the front door. I wanted to observe morning delivery. Patterns, Claire replied, gathering a thick manila envelope from her passenger seat. UPS, Postal Service, food suppliers. Anyone with regular access to the building. Inside, Claire spread the contents of the envelope across the conference table. Documents, photographs, printed emails, and what appeared to be financial records. Maria had never seen any of these materials before. Where did you get all this? Public records, mostly. Corporate filings, permit applications, campaign contributions. Information that's available if you know where to look. Claire pointed to a corporate structure chart she had created. Riverside Development Group is owned by Meridian Holdings, which is controlled by North Star Investment Partners. North Star has contracts with the city for 4 other redevelopment projects over the next 18 months. So, their average timeline from project approval to completion is 14 months, but Riverside is running 8 months behind schedule. Claire pulled out construction photographs taken from the street. Work stopped 6 weeks ago. No crews, no equipment, no activity. According to their city permits, they should be finishing the commercial phase and starting residential construction. Maria studied the images. She drove past the construction site twice a week, but hadn't paid attention to the lack of progress. Why would they stop work? Because families are still fighting the relocations. 3 pending lawsuits, 2 appeals. To the city council, and ongoing media coverage about displaced residents. As long as the community center exists, it provides a base for organized resistance. Claire laid out copies of news articles featuring interviews with families using the center's services. Every story about the redevelopment's impact on the Fae. Community mentions the center as a resource for affected families. It's become a symbol of community persistence. You think they're targeting us to eliminate organized opposition? I think North Star Investment Partners has $18 million committed to projects that won't be profitable if public opposition spreads to other developments. Closing the center eliminates the most visible reminder that redevelopment displaces actual families. Claire opened her portfolio and removed a different set of documents. But that's not the real problem. She spread out what appeared to be architectural plans and engineering reports. The Riverside project has structural issues. The soil composition wasn't properly tested before construction began. The foundation work that's already completed won't support the building specifications in their approved plans. Maria couldn't interpret the technical drawings, but Claire's explanation was clear. They need to redesign the entire project, which means additional environmental review, new permits, and probably 18 months of delays. So they're trying to eliminate community oversight while they figure out how to fix their construction problems. Worse than that, Claire pulled out financial projections that showed North Star's cash flow requirements. They're using revenue projections from the Riverside project to secure funding for their other developments. If Riverside fails, the entire company becomes insolvent. The scope of the situation was larger than Maria had understood. The center wasn't just being targeted by developers trying to eliminate opposition. It was being attacked by a company facing financial collapse. If their construction problems became public knowledge. How do you know all this? Claire was quiet for a moment. I'm good at research. Maria looked at the documents spread across the table. Corporate filings, engineering reports, financial projections, construction photographs. This wasn't information someone could gather through casual research. Claire, what kind of consulting work do you actually do? Before Claire could answer, Danny Park burst through the front door. Maria, we have bigger problems. The fire marshal is here for an emergency inspection. He says someone reported serious safety violations, and the center has to be evacuated immediately pending a full structural review. Through the front windows, Maria could see a fire department vehicle and 2 men in official uniforms examining the building's exterior. One was taking photographs while the other made notes on a clipboard. This is it, Maria said. They're going to shut us down today. Claire stood up and walked to the window. She watched the fire marshal's inspection with the same analytical attention she had applied to everything else. But now there was something different in her posture. Decision rather than observation. Danny, how long does a structural review usually take? For a building this size, 2 weeks minimum. Maybe a month if they find issues. And the center has to remain closed during the review. Complete evacuation. No staff, no volunteers, no programs. Claire returned to the conference table and gathered her documents. Maria, I need you to trust me for the next hour. Can you do that? What are you planning to solve this problem? Claire, whatever you're thinking, we can't fight the fire marshal. These are legitimate safety procedures. The procedures are legitimate. The complaints that triggered them aren't. Claire walked toward the front door, then stopped. When I come back, things are going to be different. The center will be safe, the threats will stop, and you'll be able to continue your work without interference. How can you possibly guarantee that? Because, Claire said, her voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that Maria had never heard before, I'm very good at my job. Claire left the building as the fire marshal was completing his exterior inspection. Maria watched through the window as she approached the officials, showed them some kind of identification, and began what appeared to be an intense but professional conversation. 10 minutes later, Claire returned with Fire Marshal Robert Hendricks and Inspector James Crawford. Both men looked confused but respectful. Ms. Santos, Marshal Hendricks said, there seems to have been a misunderstanding about the complaint we received. After reviewing the documentation provided by Ms. Donovan, we're satisfied that no emergency inspection is necessary. I don't understand. The complaint cited specific fire code violations that don't actually apply to buildings of this type and age. Someone provided incorrect information about your facility's classification. Inspector Crawford nodded. We'll be filing a report noting that the complaint was based on inaccurate premises. Your center can continue normal operations. After the fire officials left, Maria turned to Claire. What just happened? I provided them with the building's complete inspection history and current code compliance status. How did you have access to that information? I told you I was good at research. But Maria knew that research didn't explain what she had just witnessed. Claire had handled the fire marshal like someone accustomed to dealing with official investigations. She had produced documentation that resolved a crisis in minutes. Most importantly, both officials had treated her with the deference usually reserved for someone with legitimate authority. Claire, who are you really? Claire was quiet for a long moment. Someone who doesn't like it when people abuse regulatory systems to hurt communities. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you need right now. Claire's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it and smiled for the first time since Maria had met her. The insurance issue has been resolved. Your coverage will be reinstated as of tomorrow morning, with a formal apology from the company for the administrative error. Administrative error? Someone provided false information about the center's risk profile. When the insurance company was given accurate data, they immediately reversed their cancellation. Who provided the false information? Someone who won't be filing any more complaints about community organizations. Maria sat down heavily. In the space of 1 hour, all the coordinated attacks against the center had been neutralized. Insurance reinstated. Fire inspection canceled. And based on Claire's confident tone, the other pending issues would likely disappear as well. How did you do this? Claire packed her documents back into the manila envelope. Sometimes problems that look complicated actually have very simple solutions. You just need to know which pressure points to address. And you know those pressure points? I know people who abuse systems to harm others usually leave themselves vulnerable to the same tactics. Claire headed toward the door, then paused. Maria, the center is safe now. The harassment will stop. But there's something else you need to know. What? The families you've been serving? The ones displaced by the Riverside project. Some of Them are going to have opportunities to return to the neighborhood sooner than anyone expected. How is that possible? Claire smiled again, and this time it looked almost predatory. Because North Star Investment Partners is about to have some very serious problems that have nothing to do with community centers. 2 days after the fire marshal incident, Maria received a phone call that changed everything she thought she knew about Claire Donovan. The caller was Agent Rebecca Martinez from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. Miss Santos, I understand you have a volunteer named Claire Donovan working at your community center. I need to speak with you about her background. Maria felt her stomach tighten. Is she in some kind of trouble? On the contrary, Miss Donovan just completed one of the most successful undercover operations in the Fondo. On the contrary, Miss Donovan just completed one of the most successful undercover operations in the Bureau's recent history. We need to debrief you on what's been happening in your community. Agent Martinez arrived that afternoon carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested federal law enforcement business. She set up in Maria's office, spreading out documents that looked far more official than anything Claire had shown her. Claire Donovan isn't her real name, Martinez began. She's Special Agent Catherine Wells, and she's been working a case involving municipal corruption and construction fraud that spans 4 cities and involves approximately $60 million in fraudulent development contracts. Maria stared at the FBI identification photo that looked exactly like the woman she knew as Claire. She's a federal agent? One of our best. Agent Wells specializes in economic crimes that target vulnerable communities. Housing fraud, predatory lending, illegal displacement schemes. She's been tracking North Star Investment Partners for 18 months. Martinez opened a thick file containing surveillance photographs, financial records, and what appeared to be recorded conversations. North Star has been using a pattern of municipal corruption to secure development contracts, then deliberately creating construction problems that justify cost overruns and delays while they extract maximum profit from city budgets. But why was she here? At our community center? Because your center was never the real target. North Star needed to eliminate community oversight while they covered up evidence of their fraud. The attacks on your center were designed to distract from their systematic theft of municipal redevelopment funds. Martinez showed Maria bank records that revealed the scope of the operation. North Star received $14 million from the city for the Riverside project. They've spent less than $6 million on actual construction. The rest has been moved through shell companies to offshore accounts. So they were stealing money meant for community development? Worse, they were using federal housing grants intended to help displaced families to fund their personal enrichment schemes. Every family that couldn't find affordable housing after relocation represents money that was supposed to help them, but ended up in North Star executives' bank accounts. The betrayal was staggering. Families had lost their homes so that developers could steal the money meant to help them recover. How long has Agent Wells been investigating this? She's been tracking North Star for 18 months, but she's been working on municipal corruption cases for 7 years. Her background is in forensic accounting and corporate investigation. Martinez pulled out another set of documents. Agent Wells has advanced degrees in economics and urban planning. Before joining the FBI, she worked for the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She's an expert in identifying how criminal organizations exploit community development systems. So when she said she did consulting work in problem resolution, she was telling the truth. She resolves problems by identifying and dismantling criminal enterprises that harm communities. Maria thought about all the questions Claire had asked, all the detailed observations about the center's operations and the families they served. She wasn't really assigned community service, was she? Judge Whitmore is a longtime collaborator with federal investigations. The arrest at the protest was staged to give Agent Wells a legitimate reason to be in your community. She needed to observe North Star's operations from inside the area they were targeting. Is the protest fake? Agent Wells needed to be arrested in connection with community activism to establish her cover identity. Judge Whitmore sentenced her to community service at your center because we knew North Star would eventually target your operations. Martinez showed Maria surveillance footage from cameras that had been hidden around the construction site. Agent Wells spent 3 weeks documenting North Star's illegal activities before she started volunteering at your center. We have evidence of bribery, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to violate federal housing regulations. What about the coordinated attacks on our center, the insurance cancellation, the fire inspection? All orchestrated by North Star security consultant, a man named Victor Reeves, who specializes in using regulatory harassment to eliminate opposition to development projects. Agent Wells had been tracking his methods for months. Martinez pulled out arrest records from the previous day. Reeves was arrested yesterday morning along with 3 North Star executives. They're facing federal charges that will likely result in 20-year prison sentences. And the money? The stolen development funds? Recovered. All $14 million, plus interest and penalties. The funds will be returned to the city and dedicated specifically to housing assistance for families displaced by the Riverside Project. Maria felt overwhelmed by the scale of what had been happening around her without her knowledge. Agent Wells solved all of this by herself. Agent Wells coordinated a multi-agency investigation that included the FBI, Treasury Department, Housing and Urban Development, and the District Attorney's Office. But yes, her undercover work provided the evidence we needed to dismantle the entire operation. Martinez closed the files and looked directly at Maria. The families your center serves will have access to new housing assistance programs funded by the recovered money. The Riverside Project will be redesigned as affordable housing under federal oversight. And North Star Investment Partners will never operate another development project anywhere in the United States. What happens to Agent Wells now? That's complicated. Her cover has been maintained throughout this conversation. Officially, Claire Donovan is still a volunteer completing court-mandated community service. Agent Wells' real identity remains classified. So she keep working here? For another few weeks, until her official sentence is complete. Then Claire Donovan will move away, and Agent Wells will begin her next assignment. Maria understood the implications. The woman she had come to respect as an unusually dedicated volunteer would disappear, and she would never be able to acknowledge or thank the federal agent who had saved her community. Can I tell her that I know who she really is? Martinez was quiet for a moment. Agent Wells requested that you be briefed on the case because she felt you deserved to understand what had been happening to your community. But her operational effectiveness depends on maintaining separation between her cover identities and her real work. So I should pretend I don't know? You should continue working with Claire Donovan, volunteer coordinator, and let her complete her community service assignment. Agent Wells will know that you understand the larger situation. After Martinez left, Maria sat in her office thinking about the past 3 weeks. Claire's careful questions, her systematic observation of the center's operations, her immediate understanding of the coordinated attacks they were facing. All of it made sense now. She had been working alongside a federal agent who had saved their community while pretending to be a court-assigned volunteer. Someone whose entire purpose was protecting people like the families the center served, but who could never receive recognition for her work. When Claire arrived the next morning for her regular volunteer shift, Maria looked at her differently. Not as a mysterious woman with unusual capabilities, but as someone who had dedicated her career to fighting the kind of injustice that destroyed communities. How are the new housing applications coming along? Claire asked, settling at her usual desk with intake files. Much better than expected, Maria replied. It looks like we're going to have access to additional funding for displaced families. Claire nodded. That's good news. The families deserve better support than they've been getting. Maria wanted to say more, to acknowledge what Claire had done, to thank her for saving the center and the community it served. But she understood that the best way to honor Agent Wells' work was to let Claire Donovan finish her community service assignment without complications. Claire, Maria said carefully, I want you to know that your volunteer work here has made a real difference. More than you might realize. Claire looked up from her files and smiled. Sometimes, she said, the best community service happens when people don't realize they're being served. It was the closest either of them would come to acknowledging the truth about what had really happened in the Riverside District, and why a federal agent had spent 3 weeks pretending to sort intake files while dismantling a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. But Maria understood that some of the most important work in the world happened exactly this way, quietly, effectively, and without recognition. Agent Catherine Wells had saved their community while ensuring that Claire Donovan received credit for nothing more than fulfilling a court-mandated volunteer assignment, the perfect cover for someone whose job was protecting communities from people who never expected to be caught. 6 months after Claire Donovan completed her community service assignment, the Riverside District Community Center had become something no one could have predicted. The recovered North Star funds had transformed not just the center's capabilities, but the entire neighborhood's trajectory. Maria stood in the newly expanded facility, watching Eleanor Chun lead a financial literacy workshop for families who were preparing to move back to the Riverside District. The federal housing program had created opportunities for original residents to return to their community in affordable units that North Star had been forced to build as part of their plea agreement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The developers, who had displaced families to maximize profits, were now required to construct affordable housing under federal supervision, using their own recovered funds to provide exactly the kind of community support they had tried to eliminate. 63 families have qualified for the return program, Danny Park reported during the monthly staff meeting. He was now the center's assistant director, having completed his social work degree with help from an educational grant funded by the recovered money. Another 42 are on the waiting list. Sarah Williams had been hired as the center's housing coordinator, managing the complex process of helping families navigate their options. The new units include protections against future displacement. Residents have the right of first refusal if any additional development is proposed. Tommy Rodriguez was running a job training program that placed graduates in construction and maintenance positions with verified contractors who had been approved by federal oversight. 12 people started work this month. All of them are earning wages that allow them to afford housing in their own neighborhood. The transformation extended beyond individual families. The investigation into North Star had revealed similar schemes in 3 other cities, leading to a federal task force that specialized in protecting communities from predatory development practices. The Riverside case had become a model for how undercover operations could dismantle municipal corruption while preserving community organizations. Maria had never seen Claire again after her volunteer assignment ended, but she received periodic updates through official channels that made it clear Agent Wells continued her work protecting communities across the country. A housing fraud case in Detroit, a predatory lending investigation in Phoenix, a municipal corruption probe in Atlanta, all bearing the hallmarks of the same methodical approach Claire had used in Riverside. Judge Patricia Whitmore had officiated at the ceremony marking the center's expansion, though she made no reference to the unusual community service assignment that had started everything. She spoke instead about the importance of community institutions in protecting vulnerable populations and the need for creative partnerships between law enforcement and social services. Sometimes, Judge Whitmore had said, Justice requires approaches that aren't visible in traditional courtroom proceedings. The protection of communities happens through many different types of service. The families who returned to Riverside found a neighborhood that was better than what they had lost. The new housing included energy-efficient construction, community spaces, and small business opportunities that hadn't existed before the redevelopment. Federal oversight had ensured that the project served residents rather than developers. But the most significant change was less visible. The Riverside case had created precedents that protected other communities from similar schemes. Federal agencies now monitored development projects more carefully, looking for the patterns Agent Wells had identified. Community organizations received training in recognizing and reporting suspicious activities. Municipal governments faced enhanced oversight of their development contracts. The ripple effects extended to law enforcement training programs. Agent Wells' techniques for embedding within community organizations had become part of the curriculum at the FBI Academy. Her methods for tracking financial crimes through community impact had been adopted by field offices nationwide. Maria often wondered how many other communities had been saved by investigations that remained completely invisible to the people being protected. How many federal agents were working undercover as volunteers, teachers, or small business owners, quietly documenting crimes and building cases that would prevent harm before it occurred. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggested that protection existed even when communities couldn't see it. Unsettling because it meant that threats also existed in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The center's success had attracted attention from urban planning researchers who wanted to understand how community organizations could be strengthened against economic pressures. Maria found herself speaking at conferences about the importance of maintaining community institutions. During periods of rapid development, she never mentioned Agent Wells directly, but she always emphasized the role that careful observation and systematic documentation had played in protecting the center. Someone who understood our operations better than we did was able to identify threats we couldn't see. She would tell audiences, community protection sometimes comes from unexpected sources. Danny Park had started a graduate program in public administration, specializing in community development policy. His thesis research focused on how federal oversight could be integrated into local development processes to prevent the kind of fraud that had targeted Riverside. The scary thing, Danny told Maria during one of their planning meetings, is how sophisticated the North Star scheme was. Without someone with Agent Wells' expertise, we never would have understood what was happening until it was too late. How many communities don't have that kind of protection? Sarah wondered. It was a question that haunted Maria. The Riverside case had been resolved because a federal agent with specialized training had been assigned to investigate North Star specifically. But how many similar schemes were operating in communities that didn't happen to be under federal surveillance? The answer came 6 months later when the Justice Department announced a new community protection initiative. Federal agents would be permanently assigned to work undercover within community organizations in cities identified as vulnerable to development fraud. The program was designed to provide early warning of predatory schemes before they could displace families or steal public funds. Agent Wells had been promoted to supervisory special agent and was helping design the training protocols for the new program. Though her identity remained classified, her methods were being replicated in field offices across the country. Maria received this information through Agent Martinez, who had become an unofficial liaison between the FBI and community organizations that had been affected by economic crimes. Agent Wells wanted you to know, Martinez said during one of their quarterly meetings, that the Riverside investigation changed how the Bureau approaches community protection. Your center's experience is helping protect families in dozens of other cities. Will we ever be able to thank her properly? Agent Wells considers the center's continued success to be thanks enough. She knows that the families you serve are thriving because the community organization that supports them survived. Maria understood. Agent Wells' reward wasn't recognition or appreciation. It was knowing that communities like Riverside could resist predatory development and provide stability for families facing economic displacement. 5 years later, the Riverside District was featured in urban planning textbooks as an example of how community organizations could successfully advocate for equitable development. Students learned about the importance of community centers in maintaining neighborhood cohesion and the need for strong oversight of development projects. None of the textbooks mentioned the federal agent who had spent 3 weeks sorting intake files while documenting a criminal conspiracy. Agent Wells' work remained invisible, which was exactly how she preferred it. But Maria knew that somewhere, Agent Wells was continuing her mission of protecting communities from people who saw vulnerable families as opportunities for profit. Working quietly, observing carefully, and building cases that would prevent harm rather than just punish it after the fact. The ultimate community service, protecting people who would never know they had been protected by someone whose greatest success was remaining completely unknown. In her final report to the City Council about the center's expansion, Maria wrote a single line that only a few people would understand. Some community service happens so quietly that the community never realizes they've been served. It was as close as she could come to acknowledging the federal agent who had saved their neighborhood, while pretending to be nothing more than a court-assigned volunteer with 60 hours to complete. Agent Catherine Wells had eliminated every threat on her target list while ensuring that Claire Donovan received credit for nothing more than fulfilling a judge's sentence. The perfect cover for someone whose life's work was protecting communities from enemies they never saw coming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.